I never thought a single sentence could haunt me for years, but my sister's words still echo in my mind. You'll never be anything more than a couch-surfing loser. That night, the air felt thick with tension, made worse by the smell of oven-baked salmon and the tinkling of ice cubes in water glasses. Stephanie spoke loudly, making sure every single person at the dinner table, including our parents, caught her insult. My cheeks burned with embarrassment. For a brief moment, I glanced at my father, hoping for some kind of support. A raised eyebrow, a gentle shake of the head, anything. But he wouldn't meet my eyes. Neither would my mother. It was as if Stephanie's words had turned them all to stone. I could hear the quiet clinking of silverware against china, and that tiny sound somehow felt deafening compared to the silence from everyone else. I remember looking down at my plate, pushing some salad around, wishing I could slip through the cracks in the hardwood floor. My heart pounded so hard I half expected everyone to hear it. Instead, all they heard was Stephanie's cruel verdict. In that single moment, I felt smaller than I ever had in my life. Everyone knew I'd just announced my decision to drop out of college. I'd tried to break the news gently, but it still landed like a thunderclap. I could practically see the disapproval dripping from my parents' faces. My mother clutched her napkin, twisting it as though it were some lifeline tethering her to polite society. My father stared at the tablecloth, silent as a statue. Then, as if on cue, Stephanie launched into her ridicule. She had always been the star of the family. First to get straight A's, first to nab a big scholarship, first to flaunt her glamorous new job with curated social media posts. As she spat out those words of contempt, I was overwhelmed by both anger and shame. Anger that she assumed so little of me, and shame that, in a way, her words might be true. At that time, I really was crashing on a friend's couch. I did have 2 part-time jobs that barely paid the bills. I didn't have a shining plan for my future, just an inkling of an idea about real estate that no one seemed to believe in. That night, her mockery seemed to seal my fate in front of everyone I loved. Yet beneath my humiliation, a spark of determination ignited. As I walked away from that dinner, head low, shoulders tense, I promised myself I'd prove Stephanie wrong. I couldn't explain the pull I felt toward real estate. It was like standing at the edge of an ocean, sensing there was an entire world beneath the surface that I had to explore. I spent my nights searching online for every scrap of free information on the subject. I followed blog posts, downloaded ebooks, and watched late-night webinars, absorbing anything I could about property management, mortgages, zoning laws. Words that once sounded lifeless in a classroom now felt like keys to an undiscovered future. During the day, I juggled my 2 measly jobs, waiting tables at a rundown cafe and scanning groceries at a local market. I'd pocket the small tips from my cafe shift and immediately stash them away for some distant opportunity I wasn't even sure would come. The exhaustion left me hollow-eyed, but I refused to complain. Everyone else might have seen me as directionless, but in my heart, I was making moves. One slow step at a time, I planned my escape from the box they had put me in. Strangely, my love affair with coffee began around this time. I used to rely on instant coffee packets to keep me awake, stirring them into hot water in my friend's cramped kitchen. Those cups tasted sour, more bitterness than flavor, but they were cheap and efficient, keeping me alert enough to study after long shifts. I remember how the weak aroma would fill my nostrils and jolt my senses, reminding me I still had hours of reading left before I could catch a few hours of sleep. Over time, I became fascinated with the process of roasting and blending. The alchemy of coffee somehow mirrored the transformation I craved in my life, taking raw beans and applying enough heat, enough pressure to bring out deep, nuanced flavors. On my rare day off, I'd hang around a local roastery, inhaling the scents of freshly ground beans and listening to the gentle hum of machinery. The owner, a sharp-eyed woman named Frida, let me sample different blends. "Taste the smoky edge in this one?" she'd ask. "Notice the hint of chocolate in that other?" It awakened my senses and offered an escape from my reality. As I sipped, I felt hope brewing in me. Meanwhile, Stephanie's Instagram gleamed with perfection. I tried to avoid looking at it, but inevitably, her posts would pop up. Each photo seemed carefully orchestrated. Her with her designer handbag, her brand new car, her elaborate brunch spreads, and most grating of all, her wide, beaming smiles that spelled out her joy in bold letters. She'd caption everything with quotes about success and living your best life, ironically ignoring that she once told me my best life amounted to nothing. My relatives would comment with heart emojis and lavish praise, as if she'd already achieved a life's worth of accomplishments. In the evenings, I'd sometimes torture myself by comparing her glossy pictures to the stark reality of my borrowed couch, the dusty corners of the cafe I worked at, and the stack of real estate textbooks littering my floor. She had a real house, a real family, and a real job, everything that seemed so far from my reach. Sometimes, bitterness would rise in my throat like acid, but I'd swallow it down. I reminded myself that envy wouldn't get me anywhere. The only way forward was to stay determined, keep studying, and hold on to that faint glimmer of possibility. I poured my frustration into relentless action. I wouldn't just read about real estate, I'd live it. Weekends became my open house rituals. I'd scan listings for any properties hosting viewings, hop on a bus or borrow a friend's car, and wander through pristine halls and dusty foreclosures alike. At first, I was just an onlooker, eavesdropping on agents as they pitched to potential buyers. But eventually a veteran property manager noticed me lingering in the background. His name was Mr. Densmore, a wiry man with thick glasses who wore the same coffee-stained tie at every open house. "You've been tagging along for weeks," he said, eyeing me curiously. I confessed I had no formal training, just a keen interest. He offered me an unusual deal. Help him clean out rundown properties, and in return, he'd teach me the basics of property valuation and rental agreements. It was grunt work, scrubbing graffiti off walls, hauling broken furniture out to the curb, but I couldn't have been more grateful. Each time we finished a job, he'd walk me through the property's figures. He explained mortgages, market fluctuations, and property taxes in a way no textbook had. Every weekend left me feeling more capable than the last. In those days, coffee was my constant companion. I'd show up at beat-up houses at dawn, armed with a thermos full of strong brew, the fragrant steam curling into the chilly air. My fingers would go numb from hauling debris, and I'd warm them around that metal thermos, taking quick sips of caffeine between tasks. The more I learned from Mr. Densmore, the more confident I became. After months of saving every tip and every spare dollar from my 2 jobs, I found my first real investment, a tiny studio apartment on the outskirts of Pinebridge, a fictional city that everyone said was on the decline. I'd saved just enough for a minimal down payment and, with some creative financing, got a mortgage with a steep interest rate. My friends thought I was insane. Even my parents, in their rare phone calls, tried to dissuade me. But I pressed forward, trusting the numbers and the plan I'd painstakingly crafted. My first tenant was a college student who was thrilled to find a cheap place near campus. Her rent didn't line my pockets with gold, but it covered the mortgage. And just like that, I was officially a property owner. Owning that studio, I discovered an odd sense of pride. It didn't matter that the paint was chipping or that the hallway smelled faintly of mildew. It was mine, or at least partly mine, and it symbolized the life I was determined to create. Soon, I started scanning the market for undervalued properties, places that looked hopeless to the casual eye but had hidden potential. Every new listing was an opportunity to apply what I'd learned. I'd do the math on a scrap of paper, calculating possible rent, factoring in upkeep costs, and deciding if it was worth the risk. Sometimes I got it wrong, but each mistake was a lesson in disguise. Meanwhile, my sister continued her glamorous routine. Family gatherings felt tense. She'd flaunt her lifestyle, while I'd show up in secondhand clothes, reeking of sweat and coffee, usually late because I'd been cleaning out another grimy unit. At night, the memory of her mocking laughter fueled me. I told myself, one day, I'll have enough to breathe freely. One day, I'll walk into these gatherings without that knot of shame in my gut. My determination was no longer just a spark. It was a slow, steady blaze driving me forward. About a year into the process, I stumbled onto an unexpected side venture. A friend introduced me to a local coffee wholesaler who was looking to sublet a small warehouse space. The place was a mess, cracked windows, rodent droppings, a leaking roof, but the rent was unbelievably low. I took it as a sign. Why not expand my horizons beyond residential real estate? With a small loan, I renovated the warehouse, installed some basic roasting equipment, and partnered with the wholesaler. My role was mostly landlord, but I was fascinated by the entire coffee production line. I'd walk in and be greeted by the heady scent of beans tumbling in the roaster, a warm, nutty aroma that curled around the rafters. Sometimes I'd linger to watch the packaging process, the beans rattling into sleek bags, sealed and stamped with a logo I had helped design. Though it was a modest project, it brought in enough income to cover the warehouse mortgage, and then some. I was building more than a property portfolio. I was creating a world that, piece by piece, reflected the strength I was finding in myself. And every time I took a sip of our freshly roasted blend, I tasted possibility. Stephanie's life, from the outside, seemed bulletproof. Every time I heard from relatives, they'd talk about her expensive car, her spa getaways, and her growing family. She had married a man named Bradley. Tall, confident, with a corporate job that promised steady promotions and lavish perks. They lived in a polished suburban home with a neatly manicured lawn, hosting dinner parties I was never invited to. Occasionally, I'd catch glimpses of her life online. Photo shoots with their 2 young kids, matching holiday sweaters, curated snapshots of them at amusement parks. The contrast between us was dizzying. I was scrubbing paint off a dingy storage room while she was snapping selfies at a fancy resort, but I didn't envy her. I had my purpose now. Each new deal I closed, no matter how small, felt like another step away from that dinner table where she'd humiliated me. Over the years, I kept my head down and worked. By year 3 of my journey, I owned 6 rental units. By year 5, I'd crossed 50. By year 8, I lost track of the exact count, focusing instead on a steady system of acquisitions, renovations, and rentals. The growth was quiet, purposeful, and deeply gratifying. Then came the shock I never saw coming. I just inked a deal for a portfolio of condos in a newer development called Laurel Heights. The acquisition was complex, involving multiple investors and a dizzying stack of paperwork. After everything was finalized, I sat down with my property manager, Naomi, to review new tenant applications. We joked about the routine tedium of checking references, verifying credit scores, and scanning for red flags. My eyes flitted across each name until I hit one that made my heart skip. Stephanie Reynolds. My sister, applying to rent one of my condos. My immediate reaction was disbelief. Then a strange mix of concern and curiosity washed over me. I wondered what had happened. The application included her husband's name, Bradley, and their 2 children. They'd listed their current address as lost home with a minimal explanation, financial hardship. I took a moment to gather myself, sipping from my travel mug filled with my warehouse's latest coffee blend, a dark roast with caramel undertones. The taste reminded me to stay grounded. After all these years of forging my own path, I was now standing on a crossroad of past and present. Quietly, without fanfare, I approved her application. At first, I didn't plan on telling Stephanie I owned the place. I figured it was enough to know I could help from behind the scenes, providing a safe space for her family to land. But fate, or maybe karma, had other plans. A few months after she moved in, her name popped up again in my inbox. This time, it was an urgent email about unpaid rent. Reading the message, I felt a pang of empathy. She mentioned job losses, medical bills for one of the kids, maxed out credit cards, and no immediate source of stable income. Naomi forwarded the email to me, asking for approval to proceed with an eviction notice. Legally, we had every right. From a business standpoint, it made sense to remove a tenant who couldn't pay. But this was my sister, the same one who'd told me I was worthless, the same one who'd built a shining wall of success on social media. Seeing her in this desperate state felt surreal. For a moment, I considered letting the process go through. I remembered every taunt, every belittling remark. My anger simmered. Then I looked at the coffee mug on my desk, emblazoned with my roastery's motto, "Growth through heat." It grounded me. Stephanie showed up at the property manager's office the next day, frazzled and sweaty, with a trembling voice that carried through the reception area. I was in the back, reviewing spreadsheets, but I heard her mention wanting to speak to the owner personally. "Whoever owns this place, please, I'm begging you," she said. Her voice cracked. I peeked through the glass partition, seeing the strain on her face. She looked older than I remembered, her usual polished demeanor replaced by desperation. In that moment, I recognized the weight of fear in her eyes, the same dread I'd felt all those years ago when I had nothing. My heart pounded as I stepped forward, uncertain how she'd react. Naomi introduced me. "Here's the owner." Stephanie spun around, confusion and shock warping her features. I could almost see her thoughts churning, trying to reconcile the scrawny underdog she used to belittle with this person. Now in front of her, she blinked hard, then stared at the plaque on the desk. My name. It was a moment so thick with emotion that the air itself seemed charged. I braced myself for her anger, her disbelief, or maybe even a sneer. Instead, tears welled in her eyes. She was speechless at first, lips trembling. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. You own this entire building?" Her disbelief was palpable, and for a second, I felt a twinge of satisfaction, like a final, well-deserved vindication. But then I saw the raw vulnerability on her face. This wasn't the same proud, mocking Stephanie who had humiliated me at dinner. This was someone humbled by life's brutal twists. Before I could respond, she burst into apologetic tears. "I'm so sorry," she choked out, "for everything. I thought you'd never make it. I thought you were wasting your life. But now, it's me who needs help." Her words spilled out in a frantic rush. She confessed to losing their home after Bradley's layoff, to burning through their savings, to having no fallback plan because, truthfully, they never imagined they'd need one. She clutched her purse straps so tightly her knuckles turned white. Seeing her like this was surreal, like an alternate reality where the roles were reversed. Part of me wanted to lash out, to make her feel the sting of rejection. Another part, the part shaped by late-night studying and relentless coffee-fueled determination, wanted to show her mercy. I inhaled deeply, the faint aroma of the coffee grounds in the office's kitchenette, reminding me of the countless times I needed mercy myself. Then I told her the decision was mine. I could proceed with eviction, or I could work out a plan. She stared at me, eyes full of fear and hope. I asked if she still had any steady income, any prospects. She shook her head. She looked so broken that my anger began to dissolve. I explained that I wouldn't evict her family. Instead, I offered her a chance to catch up on rent with a lenient payment schedule, something I rarely did for anyone. And then, on a whim, I tossed in another lifeline. A job. I said I could use an assistant in the property management division, someone to help coordinate scheduling, fill in forms, handle low-level tasks. It was an entry-level position, but it came with benefits and a reliable paycheck. "Why?" she asked, voice trembling, tears still wet on her cheeks. "After how I treated you, why would you do this?" I thought back to my own journey, every snide remark, every locked door, every voice telling me I'd never measure up. "Because I know what it feels like to have nothing," I said. That night, as I locked up the office, I found myself alone in the parking lot. Lit by flickering overhead lights, the air carried the faint scent of my roastery's beans from a distant window, a comforting reminder of how far I'd come. My emotions teetered between a sense of triumph and a pang of lingering resentment. Yes, I had extended a helping hand to my sister, but I couldn't deny the old wounds she'd carved into me. I remembered the scorching shame of that family dinner, the nights I'd spent in tears after hearing her insults, and the frustration of watching everyone applaud her while ignoring my ambitions. Yet as the crisp night breeze brushed my skin, I felt an odd peace settle in. Time had changed me. I was no longer the timid, couch-surfing sibling desperate for validation. I had built something real, a network of properties, a thriving coffee warehouse, and a sense of self-worth that didn't hinge on anyone else's approval. I recalled the swirl of her tears when she realized the building was mine. If that revelation alone had any weight, it was that life has an uncanny way of humbling us. There was a kind of poetic justice in that. Over the next few weeks, Stephanie began her new job. It was surreal to see her in the office, my office, wearing business casual outfits she'd cobbled together, no longer the designer fashion plates she used to flaunt. Her shoulders sagged with the burden of learning things entirely foreign. Property management isn't glamorous. It involves endless paperwork, phone calls from stressed tenants, and late-night emergency repairs. But she dove in, determined to prove she wasn't just a charity case. I watched her struggle, flipping through training manuals, messing up simple tasks, occasionally breaking down in tears of frustration. Each time, I remembered my own stumbles when I first ventured into real estate. It struck me how the tables had turned. I was now the mentor, guiding her through complicated forms, explaining how to handle disgruntled tenants, and sometimes just offering a comforting word when she felt overwhelmed. Meanwhile, my business kept expanding. I signed a new lease for another coffee warehouse across town, and the scent of roasting beans became part of my daily life. An aromatic reminder that even the simplest things can transform into something rich under the right conditions. There were days I questioned if I was too soft, but the progress I saw in Stephanie eased those doubts. One afternoon, I found Stephanie standing in front of the massive roaster in our original warehouse, captivated by the process. The steady hiss of beans tumbling against metal was almost hypnotic. She turned to me, eyes reflecting a mix of curiosity and wonder. "I never realized coffee could be so complex," she said, breathing in the smoky aroma. I smiled, recalling my first foray into this world. It was just beans, hot air, and timing, but the result was magic. "Kind of like life," I replied. "It takes heat and patience to bring out the best flavors." She looked at me as if seeing me for the first time. "I used to think you were just lost," she confessed. "That you had no plan, no ambition, but you were doing the hard work none of us saw." I nodded, silently acknowledging her regret. She ran her fingers along the burlap sacks stacked against the wall, each labeled with exotic-sounding regions: Oak Fall Farms, Marissa Hills, Luciente Valley. I told her about the supply chains, how we sourced beans from different fictional corners of the globe, each origin imparting a unique flavor profile. Something about the conversation felt cathartic, like we were both roasting away our bitterness, forging a new blend of understanding. Time marched on, and so did the changes. Gradually, Stephanie got the hang of property management. She learned to answer tenant queries with patience rather than impatience, to send invoices on time, and to coordinate maintenance requests without mixing up addresses. A few months into her role, she even proposed a small improvement: a digital tracking system that consolidated all property-related tasks. It was a suggestion that saved everyone time and minimized errors. She began to earn the respect of the office staff, people who had no idea she was my sister. They saw her as a somewhat reserved but diligent newcomer, unaware of our tumultuous history. Meanwhile, her personal life seemed to stabilize. She and Bradley managed to sort out their debts enough to keep the family afloat. The kids seemed happier too, no longer living under the shadow of an impending eviction. Despite these positives, there were still awkward moments, lingering tension that reminded us of how things once were. But each day, as Stephanie filed paperwork or brewed a fresh pot of coffee for the break room, I saw hints of humility and gratitude that never existed before. And with each passing week, I felt a little more of my anger slip away. Eventually, word spread in our extended family that Stephanie was working for me. Rumors flew. Some whispered that I was lording my success over her. Others speculated that she was only in it for the paycheck. I ignored most of it. Our parents, though, were quietly perplexed, unsure how to navigate this new dynamic. At a family gathering, where the aroma of roasted turkey mingled with the comforting smell of home-brewed coffee, my mother finally approached me in the kitchen. "I never knew how determined you were," she said softly, her gaze full of unspoken apology. It was the closest she'd ever come to acknowledging the years she'd watched me struggle in silence. My father, for his part, awkwardly praised the smart business decisions I'd made, though he never directly addressed the emotional gulf between us. Stephanie stayed by my side most of the evening, helping me serve coffee in paper cups as relatives chatted. The questions were relentless. "So you own all these properties now? How did you learn? When did you get into coffee?" I answered politely, but the entire time I felt Stephanie's presence like a shield against old insecurities. We'd come a long way since that dinner table confrontation. A few months later, while finalizing another property deal, I was reminded how far I'd come. I was negotiating the purchase of a small commercial lot in a district known for artisan shops and bistros. The seller, an older gentleman named Lorenzo, insisted on meeting me in person. He'd heard rumors of the young entrepreneur with a coffee empire and a real estate fortune, and he seemed eager to test my mettle. We sat in a corner booth of a quaint cafe, the air thick with the scent of espresso and warm pastries. As we talked numbers, I noticed the reflection in the window. Me, calmly discussing large sums, no trace of the frantic desperation that once plagued me. Stephanie had prepped all the documents, meticulously highlighting key clauses. When Lorenzo complimented the thoroughness of the paperwork, I felt a swell of pride for her progress. We sealed the deal with a handshake and 2 cups of cappuccino. Walking out into the crisp morning sunlight, I felt more certain than ever of the value of second chances. Here I was, forging another venture, buoyed by lessons learned in the darkest times, supported by someone who once mocked me, but had now become a capable ally. Back at the office, I was greeted by the pungent scent of freshly ground beans. Our roastery employees were testing a new medium roast. I took a moment to observe the swirl of activity. Packages being sealed, labels affixed, orders documented. The synergy between my 2 main pursuits, coffee and real estate, felt almost symbolic. One required nurturing, patience, and a respect for complex flavors hidden beneath the surface. The other demanded risk-taking, calculation, and endurance. Both had taught me resilience, forced me to confront adversity head-on. Stephanie hovered at the reception desk, carefully scanning through a stack of forms. It struck me that she was no longer the woman who had tossed insults my way with a smile. Her eyes carried a quiet determination, tinged with gratitude. I caught her looking up at me, and for a second our gazes locked. No words passed between us, but the moment spoke volumes. It was as if we both understood that the old dynamic, fueled by scorn and resentment, had been replaced by something more complex: mutual respect. In that small, bustling space, amid the hum of office chatter and the comforting aroma of coffee, I felt like we had finally stepped into a future neither of us had expected. A few weeks later, I was in the roasting room, carefully monitoring the temperature gauges while the beans swirled inside the machinery. The rhythmic sound reminded me of a heartbeat, steady, persistent, full of life. Stephanie walked in, clipboard in hand, her blouse smudged with a streak of dust from sorting old files. It was a far cry from the pristine designer outfits she once posted on social media. She paused and inhaled deeply. "I see what you mean about coffee being an art," she said quietly. I nodded and let the moment stretch, the hum of the roaster filling the silence. With a timid smile, she began to share memories of her own struggles, moments in her supposedly perfect life that weren't captured by Instagram. She talked about the anxiety of keeping up appearances, the fear of letting anyone see cracks in her polished facade. I listened, hearing the echoes of my own past insecurities. Suddenly, the roaster's timer beeped, and I moved to release the beans, a plume of fragrant steam rising as they spilled out. The robust smell wafted around us, grounding the conversation in something tangible. For the first time, I realized our bond was forging anew, fueled by vulnerability, not competition. Before long, Stephanie became an integral part of the team, the kind of assistant I could rely on. She learned to juggle property listings, rent schedules, and the occasional coffee tasting notes that found their way onto her desk. What amazed me most was how sincerely she seemed to embrace her new role. Gone were the days of flaunting or belittling. In their place stood a woman who'd been tempered by life's trials, now channeling her energy into bettering herself. We started having weekly check-ins, not just about work, but about her family, her hopes, her plans to one day buy a modest home again. Each time she thanked me for the opportunity, I reminded her that the real victory was her own. She was the one showing up, putting in the hours, and adapting to a job she'd once considered beneath her. In some ways, she was living proof of something I'd believed all along: that growth is always possible, no matter how low you've fallen. As the coffee roasters whirred in the background, filling the space with that warm, familiar scent, I couldn't help but reflect on how different our paths were, and yet how they had converged in the most unexpected way. On a crisp morning, not unlike the one when I first stood before an open house years ago, I found myself sipping a fresh cup of our latest roast, a bright, citrusy blend with a hint of sweetness on the finish. Stephanie sat across from me in the office lounge, finalizing rental contracts for the Laurel Heights condos. A subtle peace settled between us, the culmination of years of struggle, regret, and ultimately redemption. As we closed the file on her own rent payments, fully caught up now, she looked at me with an earnestness I'd never seen before. "Thank you," she said. And I knew she wasn't just thanking me for the job or the leniency. She was thanking me for the forgiveness, for believing that even someone who once belittled me could change. In that moment, I realized that the biggest triumph of all wasn't the properties or the coffee brand. It was how I chose to use the success I'd built. Standing up, I poured us both another cup and raised my mug in a quiet toast. "Sometimes," I said softly, "the best way to prove people wrong is by proving kindness right. And that, I believe, is the moral worth sharing with the world."